Hello and welcome to yet another episode of Beyond the Present podcast. I'm here joined live by Poujix right here. Hey, my man, how's it going?
Everything's great.
How was life in Canada, buddy?
Everything's awesome, man. It's been warm a little bit recently, but then a couple of days ago it cooled down a little, so we're happy.
Wonderful. And of course, we have yet another special guest this time. His name is Marvin, and he's from Germany. Hey, Marvin, how's it going?
Not too bad. How are you?
I am doing terrific. Marvin, for those of the listeners who might not know you, would you just go ahead right now and give us a background about yourself?
Sure thing. As I mentioned, I'm from Germany. Basically came into the country for like an exchange. I'm studying. My fields of interest are psychology and computer science.
Wow, these are very, very relevant, by the way. Yeah. Psychology and computer science. Wow, that's pretty cool.
Thank you. Yeah. It's been a pleasure to study those two fields, and I'm actually combining them. So I'm probably going more into like human-computer interaction.
Oh my goodness! You're going for the AI, right? You want to make that human brain in the computer.
That would be the fancy stuff. That's
gosh.
Probably in the future. But yeah, we will see where it goes. I'm going to start a master's program at Uni of Waterloo.
That's right.
In the fall. So
wonderful.
Yeah.
So today's topic, we're talking about living in fantasy versus living in reality. So let's start right here. First with you, Poujix. How do you define reality and how do you define fantasy? I mean, like sometimes it's really hard to differentiate the two. Like how do you define what's real and what's not? What is a fantasy and what is real? So how do you go ahead and define basically both reality and fantasy for our listeners?
Of course, it becomes a little bit, philosophical if we want to go in depth. And I'm actually on a very many years long journey of discovering what we humans perceive as reality. But for simplicity of this podcast, I'm gonna give the very basic definition of what we mean by this. At least what I mean by this is that there are some real aspects of our life, meaning that there are some things that affecting our day-to-day lives as we go through it. And then, for example, if I go to work, do this happens, etc. So it has a real life physical impact in our world. The other one, the fantasy, being something that we imagine that has an effect, but it doesn't actually. What it affects is rather is our own mind, our own mindsets, our own school of thought, but it doesn't have any physical impact in the environment. Mm-hmm. We only perceive it, perhaps, not others.
Very nice, interesting. And how do you what's the best way to differentiate the two for somebody who might not fully understand the difference?
I think we all go through things that we say, okay, I'm worried about this, I'm worried about that, and then at the end of the day, when the problem is resolved, we say, okay, this was like nonsense, I shouldn't have worried about it, it was not real. That's literally what it is. It's just, you're making a big I gave an example to basically differentiate these two. Something that you think is a massive, a giant problem, but it's not actually. It's just a simple problem that can be resolved, and you also get to know it a little down the line. So we all had these experiences, I'm sure, and that could be one example of what is fantasy as opposed to reality in this case.
Very well. Let's go to Marvin here right now. So Marvin, how do you define reality versus fantasy?
So I think it's much easier to define reality than fantasy because I would always define fantasy as, being not real. And if you do that, you need to talk about reality. Mm-hmm. So I think reality is, as Poujix mentioned, like a really philosophical concept in terms of, finding out what is real and what is not. So first of all, I'd say that, everyone kind of has their own reality of things. Sure thing. Sometimes when we talk about reality, we talk about the real physical world, and that's an easy digestible concept, mm-hmm. and everybody understands that basics of physics, and you see things, you perceive things, and for example, if you see a tree, it's likely that other people will see the tree as well. But if you go from there and talk about, for example, behavior or motives of behavior, there it becomes really fuzzy, and it's really hard to define what is real. Like there, you often talk about truth, like what's true, what is not true. So like it's always important to have a discussion about that.
Exactly. Great point. You see, you mentioned.
Can I ask something here?
For sure. Go ahead.
How do you say reality in German?
Oh, that's a good one. Wow,
Realität.
you changed. You give a German accent. It's real. What's that?
Realität.
Awesome. Very well.
Oh, so
pretty close.
very
pretty
similar.
close.
Okay, cool.
You see, English is very close to German, actually. So overall, guys, we talking about this right now, and I just literally remembered the movie The Matrix. If you guys have watched it, basically. Where they talk about the concept of reality there as well, and the fact that a lot of us are not living in reality. We're literally living in a fantasy that sometimes usually tend to undermine our happiness and well-being in the long term. So in this episode, my focus right now is to talk from a practical point of view. That is, it's not going to be necessarily a very philosophical debate, because I really believe that ultimately the best approach towards life is to understand what is real and then focus your attention on it. Because I feel like a lot of us, we are living in this fantasy these days. I mean, on average, if you think about like various statistics, most of the books purchased are actually fiction. That is, people are willing to get lost in fiction and in stories instead of understanding the reality much better, which is why nonfiction reading now is on a decline, and fiction is, of course, always the lead in terms of reading. And people spend tremendous amount of time watching TV, news, I don't know, let's say soap operas, and various things that are not quite real. So my question right now to you guys is this. What do you think about, now that we defined reality versus fiction, let's talk about living in reality and living in a lie or in a fiction. So from your perspective, because Poujix, we talked earlier about the concept of, belief systems and the fact that we all have our own value systems which allow us to see the world differently based upon our values, based upon what we are paying attention to. So what does it even mean from your perspective to live in reality versus living in a fantasy?
So for myself, when I want to be very quote unquote realistic, try to basically perceive the word very real, I tend to use science for that, not beliefs, because beliefs tend to become very fuzzy, very borderline fantasy, maybe even in the realm of fantasy in many cases. So what I do, I try to use first principles of physics. I try to break things down to their base components there, and then see where we are putting the components and when the components actually do exist. So that's for me to basically differentiate my personal perception of reality in my life versus what I inject to make it a fantasy.
How much it affects. You said that beliefs versus science. Are you saying that belief is not real? Because in a lot of cases, the impact of belief is very real. That is, if you believe something is wrong or something is dangerous, you will literally, your body will respond to it as if it's real. So are you saying that beliefs are not real?
No, I'm not saying beliefs are not real. I'm saying if I want to differentiate, there's a phenomena, a behavior or something, and I want to differentiate between whether it's actually how much of it I'm perceiving to be or my reaction to it, how much I'm making up these stuff in my head, or how much of it actually exists. For that purpose, for the purpose of differentiating, I don't use beliefs because they sometimes tend not to be accurate. Then I try to use science. Of course, that can also be flawed, but then that comes the point that I tend to adopt this notion that I can be wrong, and I can admit that I'm wrong. But when it comes to beliefs, of course, a lot of people do that. But the tendency is a lot of people also don't admit that their beliefs might be incorrect because it's their beliefs. They tend to they have a more emotional attachment to it, so it becomes a little bit trickier. Not impossible, of course, but then because I don't want to deal with those tricky situations, potholes perhaps, I tend not to use beliefs to differentiate between reality and fantasy for my own life.
Interesting. Marvin, what is your perspective? How do you differentiate living in reality versus living in a fantasy?
So that's yeah, it's like the discussions always go, and it's kind of hard to distinguish sometimes, it's especially in when it comes to like things like beliefs. Like in a sense, I would argue that every belief that we have is kind of part of your own reality. So in other words, I'd say that there is like like basically everyone has their own virtual reality. We all living in our own kind of bubble, of course impacted by the real physical world and everything that comes with that. So going from there, it's sometimes hard to argue where you are, but my point definitely would be that beliefs definitely impact you. Beliefs belong to reality, and they should be taken into account.
Wow.
And that's what we see in science more and more now.
It is. It's a good point. That's right.
Like, I feel like it was kind of neglected, like a couple of years ago, that this kind of the black box, the mind. We just look at behavior that we can measure, but now we actually taking that into account, and we see that it's so heavily impacting us.
Exactly.
So yeah.
That's right. I like it so far. And the thing that I want to now somehow address here for our listener is the fact that we all tend to think of reality as one thing, but the truth of the matter is that every single one of us, as Marvin put out, has their own reality. And which means that our perception of reality is what we think to be real. And it really doesn't matter. That's one of the basic concepts in NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, that says the map is not the territory. That is, once you hold a map of, let's say, a nation or a country in your hand, you're not holding that country in your hand. You're holding the map of that country. However, that for you is real, which means every single one of us, we are actually functioning by a certain map. We have a map of reality based upon our belief systems. For example, let's say something bad happened to you in childhood, and from then on, you think that every single person out there is somehow, let's say fraud. So your brain, we call this your reticular activating system. It becomes super activated and focuses on this fact that people are bad, and you find a lot of reasons to justify that belief, and eventually that becomes a reality after a couple of years. And let's say you believe that everybody is nice and they want to help you. Again, you look out in the world to find the evidence to justify that belief system, and then you live with that belief system. Eventually you believe it. It becomes your reality. So here's the darn truth that I realized after studying NLP, and that is, whatever the reality is, it really doesn't matter what the reality is, because ultimately it's the perception of the reality that determines how we feel, what we do, and what we want in life. So let's talk a little bit about that perception of reality here. So Poujix, let's say that we are living with somebody who might have a different perception of reality. They have different belief systems and whatnot. So how shall we deal with people who might not see the reality as we are? I mean, like you yourself, are you a pushy person? You like to impose your belief on other people when they do not accept the reality as you do, or you simply go along and just try to find and reach a compromise?
Right. I used to be that pushy kind of person, but then I learned it the hard way that you cannot, especially with things that are very dear to some people and they have strong feelings about that, about those ideas, beliefs, whatever you want to call them. It is also almost impossible to argue in a pushy kind of way. So if you try to convince somebody their beliefs are wrong, it's never going to happen. They're just going to become defensive, and
exactly.
then it might happen over time. It might linger in their mind, and later on, 10 years down the road in their life, not just because of what you said, but then cumulative with other things that they hear, they see, they perceive, that nudges it to them towards a change in their lives. Of course, that can happen, but then I can't really change it overnight. So I tend not to argue with people's perception, and I do agree with you that at the end of the day, there isn't any. So that's, at least at this point, this is my own conclusion, that we don't have one reality. Of course, we for each person, what we perceive is our reality, and I agree with that. But then to come back to the idea of map versus territory, when I was mentioning the first principles in science, that's to get myself as close to the territory as possible. If I want to do that, I would use the tools
question,
of...
what are the benefits? Why do we need to get as close to the territory as possible if ultimately it's the map that defines who we are, what we want, and what we do?
No, it always matters, actually. It doesn't always matter, but sometimes it does. So if you want to climb a mountain and the mountain isn't there, then it becomes impossible. So when you are actually interacting with the territory rather than the map, it becomes super important. But in most of our in more than half of our lives, maybe it doesn't really matter, and that's why we simply can live without having a perfect map of the territory. And that's a good thing in a sense, because we don't have to worry about it too much. But then sometimes it does. And for example, if you want to send a shuttle into space, it does matter what the map is, because otherwise it's not going to go into space, or it's going to go to the wrong orbit, or it's going to come back, hit you down. So sometimes it becomes super important, and for that purpose, I tend to rethink my values, be prepared that I can be completely wrong, that I have that acceptance in my life.
Very good point. Marvin, what is your perspective here? And when you deal with someone who might not see the reality as you do, let's say you are, as Poujix mentioned, you're in the same territory, but you have very different maps. How do you deal with that person in this situation? Do you tend to impose your belief on that person, or do you simply accept it? What is your general reaction in this situation?
So I guess back in the days I was trying to impose, definitely, and I think that's like a really normal human behavior, I'd argue. But I was really realizing that this is kind of going nowhere, especially if you think that your reality is superior, or better evaluated than somebody else's. You're missing a lot of things. You're missing points. You're not able to see all the things that are there anymore. You basically, by imposing your reality on somebody, you're less likely to see the reality. So I definitely be careful with saying that one reality is better than the other reality, which technically that might be true, but if you're living in one of those realities, it's kind of hard to make that point.
Exactly. It's so true. Great point.
So yeah.
Go ahead if you want to finish your statement.
So yeah, I guess that's
pretty much it. So before I go any further, I just wanted to let our audience know about this matter. Poujix mentioned earlier something very nice. He said, I want to get as close to the territory as possible. And I asked him why. And here's the real reason why I think he's absolutely right. And we all should strive to get to know the territory much better. Because let's be honest, guys, in life, our belief system can allow us to feel good no matter what happens. This is what we've called, let's say, meditation. This is what we've called hypnosis. So it is possible to feel good no matter what is happening. But there's one thing that is different between those who see the reality closer to the real version versus those who just have a wrong perception. And can you guys guess what it is? What's the major difference between two happy individuals, one of which is living by a false belief system that makes him or her happy, and the other person has this happiness, but his frame and his map of reality is much closer to the territory? How can you, like, in terms of the results they get, what types of results will these people have in the end in terms of difference?
I was just going to go very quickly. I think I was going to say results. That's what I was going to say. I think they're going to have better byproducts in a general sense. Exactly. This product could become for the use of others as well, or for themselves.
So true. That's so true. So you're saying that the one who is living by the reality not only gets better results, but also can share that results with others. Whereas somebody who lives in his own head and believes that he or she is, let's say God's gift to humanity, that's just a personal self-deception.
Yeah, I mean, again, so that person we probably never heard of, or we actually might have, but then maybe in the wrong context or not in the right context, perhaps. But then, for example, a person like Marcus Aurelius, we all know who he was, or even if we don't, we have all been impacted throughout history by his accomplishments. And he was a happy man, and he had a very good map of the territory, and he impacted the world for the better.
Impacting the world. That's a great keyword here. Marvin, what's the difference between those who are living happy on a map that is not real versus those who are trying to explore the territory and make a map that is as accurate as possible?
That's hard to say. So like Puya mentioned that the results are kind of a thing here, and I agree with that. I think that somebody that's closer to reality is also able to shape reality. But I think then you also mentioned at the beginning that, fiction writing and this kind of stuff is really in. And I think fiction in itself kind of, shapes reality too. So thinking of like somebody that lives in a fantasy and for example, being like a fiction writer, they have a huge impact on other people too. So it's not always about like the outcome of it. I kind of see where this is going. Like, you know, reality, like being close to reality gives you the capability of changing it, as I said. But not being close to reality is not always negative. That's my point.
Interesting. So Marvin believes that it's not always necessary or even bad to be distant from reality. It's okay to be lost in fantasy sometimes. Poujix, what do you think about this?
I think ultimately it comes down to what you want to achieve. If you want to have an interaction with the territory, again, as I mentioned, if you're trying to climb a mountain in your map, which doesn't exist in the territory, it becomes impossible. Not improbable, but rather impossible. So then your perception of reality also changes. Your map changes. You might become disappointed. Exactly. You might lose happiness. You might lose hope, or you might judge your beliefs or whatever it is. So my point is, yeah, sometimes it doesn't matter if you're trying to read a book, a fiction book, and enjoy the story, enjoy the aspects of the story. It's perfect. If you want to write a story to influence people to use Inception line, sort of like the movie, basically give an idea to them indirectly through a story. That's perfect. I enjoy that. I use that. But then again, at the end of the day, I think it comes down what you want to achieve. And sometimes it's good to be close to fiction because you can teach lessons indirectly sometimes somehow, and then influence people, etc. But then if you want to interact with that territory that we're talking about, it becomes really tricky. It might work, but it also might become very disappointing.
Interesting. And what I just thought about right now. Go ahead, Marvin. Just to that, I agree with you that it's about what people want, but this wish kind of like to change things. This is not sometimes the only thing that you need. So if you look at people that live in a fantasy, often it's the one with like mental diseases, with like mental health issues, with trauma. So sometimes saying that, you know, just be closer to reality, this is damn painful, and it's kind of like, you know, I think you need to be really careful about how you approach those issues, because one benefit of living in a fantasy is that it can ease pain from reality. Wow. You know, real pain that is there, and I think we should be focusing on that too. You know, it's like, I think a good comparison is like talking about obesity, and then, you know, saying, well, you just need to want to stop eating. You know, you just cut the burgers or something. You know, this is sometimes a really almost ignorant thing to say, because obesity, and I think same as like trauma, like those need to be, you know, looked from a broader perspective. And then you're talking about like, you know, access to therapy, or you know, less burger stores close from where you live. Sometimes just like easy and simple things like that make you capable of living closer to reality. So sometimes it's not just the wish of living close to it. Sometimes you need to be capable of it too, and I think that's where the work needs to go in. Interesting.
Good point.
Good point. I like it so far. It's a great argument. And what I was thinking about was this huge contrast that we have in the West, which is, on the one hand, we say things like, "Do not lie to yourself. It is bad to live in with self-deception and whatnot. And the worst form of deception is indeed self-deception and whatnot." On the other hand, we also say, "Fake it till you make it." Now, in my personal life, I have experienced both sides. That is, there were many moments in my life where eventually by faking things, it actually led to making things, quote unquote. And on the other hand, of course, there were times where I was basically hurt by self-deception. So let's talk a little bit about this issue as well for our listeners. First, you, Poujix. On the one hand, we say, fake it till you make it. So if we want to fake it, this means we're actually living in something that is not real. We're living in a fantasy. Let's call it visual. They call it visualization. we call it fantasy, right? So you visualize things, you perceive things that are not there, and this helps you to achieve your goals. And this is true. It happens to everyone. On the other hand, of course, we blame those who are engaged in self-deception, who lie to themselves, who tell themselves, oh, I'm so good, I am this and that, but on a deep level, they know that they are not. So how do you somehow deal with this dilemma here and these contrasting beliefs?
Right. Sometimes I'm going to put this out there, and I'm going to explain it. Sometimes ends do justify the means. Meaning, I'm trying to say that this idea of lying to yourself, whether for fake it till make it or to make yourself feel better, is a tool. And tools don't have inherent good or bad in them. Like a match that creates fire, you can create fire to burn a house down or to cook your food. You're not going to go and say, okay, match is a bad thing or is a good thing. It depends on how you use it.
You can just simply order the goddamn food in a little. They're going to bring it to your home. It's going to be a lot easier.
Somebody's got to light the match. Somebody's got to light the match. Okay. But good point. So what I'm trying to say, lying to yourself in this sense, in these two categories, are merely a tool that people use sometimes to escape the truth, the reality, because it's too painful, because they want not to face it. That of course happens, and that's very destructive. Because, well, if you're not facing something and you don't want to challenge it and leave, go for the betterment, obviously it's not useful. Because if you accept it, you can just solve it and make yourself better. Not in all cases, I'm generally saying, like, not taking it out of context, but then in a very general sense. But then, as you mentioned, I've faced both ways. I lied to myself and I regretted it, and I faked it till made it, and I was happy about it. So again, if I'm using it for a purpose of, fake it till make it kind of situation, then it becomes, again, a tool that I'm using. I'm lying to myself to boost myself temporarily, to basically go further, to increase my confidence maybe, or whatever the reason is, to basically till I make it, till I'm actually confident. I don't have to lie to myself to be confident then that could become a positive thing.
Interesting. Marvin, you mentioned earlier that sometimes we need to escape the reality and take shelter in fantasy to avoid the pain and whatnot. So what do you think about this matter? Those who might engage in self-deception for feeling better versus those who use that fake it till you make it approach in order to achieve their goals and realize their dreams?
Well, from a psychological perspective, fake it till you make it is like immensely effective. It's just, it makes sense to do it, I guess. Like, if you're kind of telling yourself that, you're good, you're lovable, or whatever you come up with, this might lead into exactly that. And I think this is just, as Puya mentioned, just a really good tool to kind of overcome this negativity that, I don't know, we experienced through trauma or whatever. I think it becomes an issue if you try to cover up things. So if it's a difference whether I'm saying, okay, I want to be, I want to be a great, soccer player, and, I'm working hard to achieve this dream, or whether I'm telling myself, well, I'm already the greatest, but I'm just doing that because I experienced something really negative and just, trying to cover it up. Right. Trauma. Exactly. So I think, helping those people is key to it. And then more people are going to be able to perceive reality as it is.
Interesting. Great perspective. I love it. So now we're running basically out of time gradually. So let's go try to first talk about which is the best approach for both of us right now. So Poujix, when is it better to focus on getting as real as possible, and when do you think it's okay to engage in fantasy? How do you differentiate, like, when's the right time for each of this?
Look, at the end of the day, this is the part that you have to be realistic at first, and then decide where you want to go. As I mentioned, eventually, it most importantly depends on what you want to achieve and with what strategy helps you better to get there, and how can you do that. So again, if you're trying to climb a mountain, the mountain has to be there. I know I keep repeating myself, but then I'm trying to say, as Marvin mentioned, if you want to become a soccer player, it's good to encourage yourself. I'm good, but then putting in the work, I can get there, I can do this. Even though you might not actually believe it, that's fine. Lie to yourself that way. But then if you're like, no, I'm already the greatest soccer player, and then you're sitting on the couch eating potato chips, that's a problem, of course.
I think I know somebody like that,
again,
actually.
Right. I think we all know. But the point being, so at first, it really is important at what you're trying to achieve. When we go to the cinemas to watch a movie, if it's a documentary, different story. Sometimes it's based on a true story, also a different story. But then most often than not, we try to escape our reality because we just want to shut our minds off, enjoy some fantasy. That's perfectly fine too, because sometimes we do need those escapes. Sometimes we need to switch off. And that's actually sometimes positive in our real life, because getting distance from what quote unquote our reality sometimes helps to keep to put it in perspective. So at the end of the day, it's a very hard question to answer in one or two sentences, but I can say it really comes down to what you're trying to achieve.
Interesting. Very well. Marvin, when do you want to get real, and when do you want to get lost in fantasy?
Well, personally, I'm trying to be as real as possible, because I really appreciate my life so far, and I've been blessed with many things. So my reality is already pretty good, and I want to try and continue working on that. With that being said, sure, sometimes going into a fantasy world is just entertainment. It's fun. Why not? So. Yeah, as Puya mentioned, it's really depending on the cause. Generally speaking, well, let me close here with two points. So one is, I think sometimes reality and the challenge and the work that comes with it is sometimes worth itself. It has a worth in itself. Right. If you think of fantasy, we always think of a pleasure world where everything is positive. While I think, putting in the work, putting in the effort, treating people with respect, it all costs a little bit, but it gives you a huge reward that we might lose in a fantasy world. And the second argument is that what I just said, it sounds really ignorant to somebody that went to drama, and it's kind of that person is kind of hiding in a fantasy world, just being like, just putting in extra work, that's a good thing. To somebody that lived through drama, it's not a nice thing to say. So I think, as I mentioned, helping people to leave fantasy is key. But that's about it, I guess.
Well. And I think what you both have in common, Poujix and Marvin, is that you both appreciate your realities, and I think that's very important. I myself, do true. Like to think of like medicine. Let's just think of medicine, like morphine. Let's say you just broke your leg, and in that case, having some painkiller can temporarily help. Painkiller being that fantasy world. But ultimately, guys, in the end, if you really want a long-term solution, you want to make your reality in a way that is not so painful and traumatic that you have to constantly escape from it, which is why I am against escapism when done in an extreme way as a means of lifestyle. When escapism becomes your lifestyle, you become so nerdy and you move from comic book to video games, and from video games to movie, and then from movie to some novels, and you're not doing anything with your life, then at that point, there is no future. Then it means you become literally addicted to that fantasy, and you cannot build your reality up. With that being said, of course, as Marvin mentioned, there is a degree of entertainment in just enjoying the fantasy. And let's be honest, sometimes you just want to relieve your stress. I mean, if you're always living in reality, things will get a little bit boring sometimes, if not too stressful. So it's important to have that right balance. But if I were to somehow give my approach, I'd say you should be at least 80% concerned with the reality and 20% of fantasy. Using that, conventional 80-20 approach here, I would just definitely go for that one. So we're running out of time here right now. So Poujix, let's wrap up the show and reach a final conclusion here. after all of our discussion with you and Marvin regarding fantasy versus reality, self-deception versus trying to somehow deal with reality and improve it, what is now your conclusion about this discussion?
Right. I want to both, condone your comments of, I also, for a general remedy, I would also go with majority reality, of course, but then I wouldn't completely rule out a fantasy. I don't think it's even possible, but let's say even if it's possible, just don't rule it out, the fantasy part, but put it in the minimum chart. And also Marvin's points of, these things that we just said might be seem very ignorant to somebody who's going through a very, very tough time, which is having the problem that I'm not having, perhaps. But at the end of the day, even our reality, the fact that these things happen, how we perceive it is our perception, and it has nothing to do with the real world or the fictional world. The fictional world, me and you might read the same novel or watch the same movie and have completely different perceptions, completely different ideas of what it meant, what it was trying to say, or this character was lovely or not lovely, or hate this character or that. So at the end of the day, it also depends on our perception. Although there's one thing that is real and one thing that is fantasy, they are both perceived in our mind at the end of the day. So we also want to put in check our perception, which we're going to obviously talk about in depth in a different episode. But then at this point, I want to bring it up that it's also very important key component here.
Fantastic. And Marvin, what is your conclusion after all of our discussion?
So first of all, I want to say that the medicine metaphor that you just brought up, I really like this one. Like, this is perfectly describing what I try to say throughout this podcast. I really think talking about fantasy, it comes down to escaping from reality versus enjoying fantasy. So I think if you here and there go into fantasy, it might be often, but as long as you're not escaping from reality, I think it's a good thing. And I think it can help ease pain here and there. So I wouldn't say that fantasy is bad or good in general. As Pouya mentioned, it's a tool. And yeah, in general, living close to reality is, for me, beneficial. I think it's a good thing. It enabled me to do many things. It enabled me to actively change my life for the better. And I'm really happy that I'm able to do that.
Wonderful. That's the best approach. Having that great reality where you are not supposed to escape it all the time. It's so important. And you said something very nice, enjoying the fantasy versus escaping reality. I think it's much better for us to just enjoy fantasy as a form of recreation rather than just escape it. Great point. And of course, running out of time here, it was a very wonderful discussion that we had today. Of course, Marvin, it was we were very glad to have you for our show, basically for this episode for the first time, and hopefully we're going to have you in the future as well. And to you, Poujic, as well.
Thanks for having me.
For sure. And to you, Poujic, my man, great ideas. I loved it so much. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And this is all the time we have for. If you're listening to us right now, please just pause right now and go leave us a review on iTunes, some ranking.
Right now.
It doesn't take much time, guys. Like, literally, it takes less than 3 minutes. And, of course, we'd like to hear your feedback, how we can improve the show. Please let us know. This was Beyond the Present podcast, and my name is Daniel Morgan. Thank you very much.